start. It's wonderful to see such a full house. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Also, it's very nice to have members of the Mishaqa family in the audience. And it's very nice to introduce Dr. Peter Hill, who's a historian of the modern Middle East and an associate professor at Northumbria University in Newcastle, the UK. And I've been very lucky because we just had a couple of events in Newcastle and in Oxford where we were discussing our books and the role of biography in writing the modern history of the Middle East. So Peter specializes in the Arab world in the long 19th century. His research focuses on political thought and practice, the politics of religion and translation and intercultural exchange, and he's also very interested in comparative and global history. And this is his most recent book, which is a biography, a study of Mikha'il Mishaqa, but he has also authored another book. So this just came out last year. And he has another book which is entitled Utopia and Civilization in the Arab Nahda, which was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. And I'm very happy also to introduce our discussant, Dr. VARAK KETSAMANIAN, who's an assistant professor here at AUB and who also is a historian of the modern Middle East, also focusing on the long 19th century and the early 20th century, in particular on political, social, and intellectual developments. So please join me in welcoming Peter and VARAK.
Thank you.
And the floor is all yours.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Sonia, for that lovely introduction. And thank you also in advance, VARAK, for being discussant later on. And thank you to everyone for being here. I mean, it's really a great opportunity to talk about this topic here at AUB in Beirut, at an institution which has many links, as I shall explain a little bit with the topic of this book, this man, Mikha'il Mishaqa. And of course, I'm particularly happy that members of the Mishaqa family are here with us today. That's, you know, it's a very special occasion for me in many ways, and I'm very honored to be here. So, this is the person I'll be speaking about, the main subject of my book, Mikha'il Mishaqa, who lives between these dates from 1800 till 1888. In what was then Ottoman Mount Lebanon, later in Damascus, also visited Egypt, very importantly. And he lived through very turbulent times in this part of the world. He's perhaps best known as a chronicler of the upheavals of the history of Mount Lebanon, and particularly of sectarian violence. So he writes a famous account of the massacre in Damascus in 1860, which of course relates to the civil war that's then going on in Mount Lebanon, leaves a very vivid account of his narrow escape with his life from the attack on the Christian quarter by a crowd of Muslims in 1860. And the book cover has an artist impression of those events, the sort of orange picture up there. That's supposed to be Damascus at this time. But in many ways, what I wanted to do in this book was to go earlier in Mikha'il Mishaqa's life and look at what had brought him up to that point of 1860, which was so dramatic and so traumatic for him and for others. Because he's already had, by this point, a very wide and varied career. He's been a merchant, a banker, an advisor to rulers in the Shahabi Emirate in Mount Lebanon. He acted as a diplomat and even a kind of secret agent for foreign powers as well, the British in particular, later on the Americans. He worked as a doctor, and he also had many writings and publications in a whole range of disciplines, from music to mathematics, to history to religion. So because his life is so varied, in this book I've tried to use his story as a way into many different aspects of the general history of Ottoman Syria and Lebanon in particular, to take him as a kind of guide through this very turbulent period of the region's history. But there is at least one common thread that I think ties together many of these different episodes in his life. And this is his search for religious and scientific truth. And this will be the main sort of theme, I guess, that I will be using to link together the parts of the talk I'll give today. Mikha'il Mishaqa changes his religious views, in a sense his whole worldview, several times, but I think at least that he's quite consistent in what he's looking for, in how he's responding to the world around him. Particularly, he's living through repeated experiences of crisis and instability, but he's trying to respond to it using his reason, this category reason, al-aql, which is extremely important for him and his intellectual development. So in the time that remains, I'll basically go through some of the stages of his life in a bit more detail and try and relate them to his search for intellectual and religious truth. And then in conversation with VARAK, we can also reflect on some of the other aspects, the wider areas of the region's history that I've been using Mikha'il Mishaqa as a guide to. So, in 1800, he's born in Rashmaya, near Deir al-Amar, in Mount Lebanon. His father is a Greek Catholic, Rum Catholique. He's the banker to Emir Bashir Shahabi, the famous emir of Mount Lebanon. And so the young Mikha'il grows up in the atmosphere of the court of the Shahabi emirs at Teddin and Deir al-Amar. And from very early in his life, as a young boy, he's already very conscious of the instability of the world around him. So much later, in his 70s, he writes his memoirs, a manuscript of which is here at AUB. And as Deir al-Amar, people rather sort of romanticized representation to remind people of it. But this is what he writes rather later about this period of his life growing up. His father, Syriathe Mishaqa, reckoning that the vicissitudes of time, this phrase, taqallubat al-dahr, would overtake his sons as they had overtaken him, that is Syriathe, when he had no trade, no profession to live by. He set about teaching them different trades after teaching them to read and write. So Syriathe Mishaqa and his father as well had been bankers, this role of sarraf, working actually for the famous governor of Said and Akka, Jazar Pasha, in the 18th century. So they'd been very wealthy in this role, but then suddenly were out of favor. And his grandfather died, and then Syriathe Mishaqa fled to Egypt and then to Deir al-Qamar and lived under an assumed name there, incognito. And it was then a while before he could work himself back to a position of wealth and influence at the court of Emir Bashir Shahabi. So that's what he's thinking of when he's thinking of these vicissitudes of time in terms of his own family history. And quite soon after this education of Mikha'il Mishaqa begins, he thinks he finds, or he thinks he has found a key to understanding why these taqallubat, these vicissitudes, are happening in the world around him. So a few days before his 13th birthday, in 1813, there's an eclipse of the sun, which is visible from Mount Lebanon. And a few days later, there's an enormous snowstorm, which kills people, destroys crops, damages houses, all of this. And many people in the mountain at the time give this an astrological explanation. That is, they think, and Mikha'il Mishaqa comes also to think this, that eclipses announce great events, like wars, plague, or the death of some great man. So, astrology. And for that reason, Mikha'il Mishaqa says, I wanted to attain that knowledge as well. Now, he's looking back on this from a much later point when he's rejected this view. He's saying, these are the charlatans, right? The Dajjalin. But this is the start, in some ways, of his search for truth, for explanations of the world around him. He's lived through this experience of instability, crisis, great events which are happening, natural disasters on the one hand, a snowstorm or a plague, but also human-made ones, disasters within society, like the rise or fall of different rulers, wars, the death of a ruler that can lead to great instabilities again. And he's searching for a way to predict, to announce, see what announces these events. And in some ways, this is a potential rational explanation. If astrology is true, it will give you a solution, a key to understanding when these things will happen. Okay, so fast forward a bit. A few years later, age 17, Mikha'il Mishaqa travels from Deir to Damietta in Egypt. This is a very different social world to the world he grew up in on the mountain. Damietta at that time is a very busy, bustling city, the main hub for trade between the whole of Ottoman Syria and Egypt. And this is a picture from rather later, but it gives you an idea. You have these scenes rather like Venice, where the barges would come in directly and unload goods and load them again along the frontage of the Nile, and these great wakelas, as they call them, the caravanserais, in which people would live in the upper quarters and then the goods would be underneath. And it's a very varied social environment, lots of different kinds of people passing through the city of Damietta. So travelers from the time refer to peasants coming from Palestine, fleeing famine, imams coming from Istanbul, Jews from Rhodes, and also Egyptian Coptic Christians, both going to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. But at the heart of this very busy city, or the heart of its trade with Syria, really, is a small but wealthy community of Christians who were merchants from Beled Hashem, so Shawem. And the young Mikha'il Mishaqa took his place among them. He already had an uncle and an elder brother who were established in Damietta and settled down to the business of making money and learning how to be a merchant. But there was a problem, a fly in the ointment. This was the plague. Every spring, the plague appeared in town. And at the height of the plague season, you could have anything up to 100 funeral processions, which may have looked like this or may not have done. This isn't directly from there, which could be seen leaving the city. So it's killing a lot of people at the height of the plague. And it stayed in town for several months, from the spring, early or late spring, through to June or July. And obviously this presents a problem for everybody who's living in the city. Everybody's exposed to it. But there was no consensus on what to do about it. People responded in different ways. Many people, Muslims and Christians, Jews as well, resorted to prayer. So religious invocations to ward off plague. There are also other kinds of magical means to try and protect oneself from plague, like these magic squares that you can find in manuscripts, which could be drawn on the walls of houses or rooms to protect them. Others, or indeed the same people, look to medical means, different kinds of medicine which offered ways of protecting against plague. But doctors were not agreed at this time as to what plague was or how one should protect oneself against it. Some thought that it spread by touch, others thought that it was from breathing in the air. And the different remedies were also much disputed. So, for instance, there's a European doctor, an Irishman who visits Alexandria around this time, who says the best way to protect yourself from plague, he's regularly visiting the plague hospital, is to drink a glass of strong Cyprus wine before you enter it, and then smoke a big cigar as you're walking around. And this will strengthen your body against the plague, and then will fumigate the air around you to stop the infection from coming to you. So there are divisions on what one should do, should we say. And particularly among the quite wealthy Syrian Christian community in Damietta, there was a form of what we would now call lockdown. People shut themselves away in their houses to protect themselves from disease, and everything that came in was carefully washed in either water or vinegar, depending on what sort of thing it was. And there were very strict rules to be observed to ensure that one was not infected. And this they called actually lockdown. Qafla was the term used. Qafla. Qafla, no, qafl. So the point is that there's many different reactions to this, and these could cause disputes. If you adopt these elaborate medical precautions, this could be seen to be denying the power of God, who decides who should live or die from plague. but relying on magic or on prayer alone could also seem dangerously careless. And in this very busy, mixed society of this port city, different belief systems were rubbing up against each other as they were all confronting shared challenges. So soon after Mikha'il Mishaqa arrives in Damietta, he encounters this himself. I won't read all of this out, but basically his brother Andros fell sick of plague, but then recovered. And above the door of his room, Mikha'il found papers which had been written by the priest, the Greek Catholic priest of the community, which had a religious slogan, Virgin Mary conceived immaculately, right? And these he had blessed and placed above the rooms, and people told him this was supposed to stop the plague entering the place. But Mikha'il Mishaqa said, well, how long have these been here? And he said, well, they've been there for 5 years. And obviously his brother fell sick more recently than that, and he was in this room. So he said, well, I don't believe it. As he said later, again, this is from his memoirs, this is a priestly superstition. He didn't believe that this was possible. He's told by the people who believe in this, don't be of little religion, don't sow doubts. But he remains unconvinced. So this perhaps shows one way through Mikha'il Mishaqa himself that another kind of natural disaster, in this case the experience of plague, could lead to changes in one's thoughts and beliefs. People disagreed on how to deal with this disaster, and it could cause doubt about which method is best or whether any of the methods is good. And again, this is one of the themes that it's interesting to use Mikha'il Mishaqa as a way into in the book. What did people in this part of the world actually believe around the year 1800 or 1817? What were the limits of faith or of doubt? What did it mean to be disturbed or confused about religion, as Mishaqa described himself? تبلبلت أفكاري في أمور الديانة is how he describes his crisis of faith. My ideas became confused in the matter of religion. But actually, Mikha'il Mishaqa found quite a specific way out of this doubt or confusion, the adoption of a new kind of worldview which rejected organized religion in toto as such. And this also had its roots in the city of Damietta and its community of Syrian merchants. So for more than a decade by this point, 1817, 18, the richest Christian merchant in the city, Basili Fakhr, a Greek Orthodox Christian, had been sponsoring the translation into Arabic of a wide range of writings from the European Enlightenment. So this included science that had been come up with in the wake of Isaac Newton, a new kind of scientific ideas, but also the skeptical thought of French deists and novels written in the Enlightenment era of Europe. This is the first time these kinds of texts are available in Arabic, and some manuscripts, again, are here in the AUB library. Mishaqa had actually read some of these books already back home in Lebanon, because one of his uncles had been in Dumyat and been in touch with them and brought them back. So he's already been using these to look for the ideas about astronomy that he thinks are important to predict eclipses. But gradually, as he reads his way into this system of Enlightenment science, he comes to see it as a system of natural laws, which can explain and predict the phenomena of nature, things like the movements of the stars and the planets, with mathematical precision. On the other hand, the laws that are laid down by religions come to seem very doubtful, very irrational. And the seal is really set on this intellectual change when Mikha'il reads this book translated into Arabic, The Ruins of Empire, Les Ruines, by the French philosophe Volney, who had himself traveled through Syria and Egypt a few decades before this. So Volney argued that human affairs were just like the natural world in the sense that they are also governed by what he calls natural laws, regular in their course, consistent in their effects. But religions were mystifications of these laws, derived from misunderstandings of the cosmos, and then kept going by the elites of priests who sought to maintain their own power. So, as Mikha'il will later put it in one of his later religious writings, I came to think that all religions were lies, that religious laws had been created by the wise as a bridle for the ignorant. And instead of this, instead of, all of these laws are false, this quotation, sorry, a slightly different one, that كل الشرائع فاسدة, as he puts it, and that God demands instead only that we walk according to the natural light, and nur al-tabi'i, which is planted within us. And as against that, all of the things that the different madhahib, the different religions or sects have in their books were falsehoods, delusions, abatil, wasawis. So, although outwardly Mikha'il Mishaqa continues to remain a Greek Catholic, he doesn't want to cause scandal to his family, other members of his community, he's rejected these ideas. For himself, internally, these are things which are, as he sees them, irrational, delusions, falsehoods. And he thinks then, as a result of this, that he's come to quite a good understanding of both the natural world and the human world. The instabilities, the crises which they're subject to, can be reduced to natural laws, which are regular and consistent. And these can be understood by the reason, this concept of al-aql, reason, which becomes a key concept from this point onwards for Mikha'il Mishaqa. And against this standard of reason, things like magic and astrology, but also all religions, can come to seem irrational and false. So, Mishaqa returns to Mount Lebanon in 1820. He's fed up of the plague and the lockdowns that, as he said, imprisoned me in my house for around 5 months of each year. And he goes back to the mountains, building on his family's role as merchants and as bankers to Amir Bashir Shahabi. He becomes quite close to the centers of political power in the emirate. When he's still in his 20s, he becomes the banker and chancellor, mudabbir, to the Shahabi emirs in Hasbaya, in Wadi Taym, and is given considerable revenues from agricultural lands to live on. He continues to educate himself. He studies medicine after he falls ill briefly. He writes a very innovative mathematical-style treatise on Arabic music, and he also maintains his skepticism about religion. I mean, you find in his memoirs accounts from this period of him poking fun at the claims of different clerical men of religion, both Christian and Muslim. And this is also his attitude when he encounters in 1823 a new kind of religious figure in the area, who is a man called Jonas King, one of the early American Protestant missionaries who had recently arrived in Syria. And he finds this handsome young American in Dir al-Qamar disputing with the local Catholics, and he sits and listens, and as he says in his memoirs, I laughed secretly at both sides. But 20 years later, again to fast forward, he would come to have a very different attitude to these religious doctrines, the ones brought by these Protestant evangelical missionaries to Syria and Lebanon. He would go through another major change in his worldview, which again, I think it's possible to trace to an experience of crisis and change in the world around him. So, what had happened in these 20 years? In 1832, the armies of Muhammad Ali, or Mehmed Ali, the Pasha of Egypt, had invaded Syria. They ruled it for the next 8 years until 1840, commanded by Muhammad Ali's son, Ibrahim Pasha. And they began what was really quite a new project for a centralized state in Syria, which would reduce the power of the local elites in the mountains, people like the Shahabi emirs, and institute things like direct taxation and conscription, and in particular disarm the population. Now, Mikha'il Mishaqa initially does reasonably well out of this. He moves from Hasbaya to Damascus in around 1836. He gets married to Elizabeth Faris, who's the daughter of another wealthy Greek Catholic merchant from Damascus. He does well in trade and lending money. As the power of the lords in the mountains, the Muqatajis, like the Shahabis of Hasbaya, is declining, he's able to link himself to new patrons, like the Egyptians. He works as a doctor for the Egyptian administration, and also the British. So he becomes quite close to the British consul in Damascus, and foreigners are becoming increasingly important to the local politics through this period. But not everybody is doing so well as he is out of Egyptian rule, and there are major rebellions against the disarmament, taxation and conscription that they're implementing through the 1830s, first in Jebel Nablus and then Palestine, and then later in the Jebel Alawi, and then in Hawran and Jebel al-Sheikh, and finally in 1840 in Mount Lebanon, Jebel al-Nen. And at that point, the whole question of who will control power and force in Syria becomes entangled with international geopolitics, not for the last time, through what was then called the Eastern Question, which I could go into in great detail. This is a whole area that I'm now working on, and another part of the project, which Mikha'il Mishaqa's life allows one to see, but I will keep quiet about that and move on with the story. But basically, there's an intervention in 1840 by the British and the Austrians, as well as the Ottomans, to get Muhammad Ali out of Syria. And this involves, among other things, the bombardment and destruction of Akka in Palestine by the British Navy. The fort is almost completely destroyed and most of the town. This is very dramatic. In the wake of this, then, in 1841, 42, there are many different claimants to power in Mount Lebanon, and what emerged gradually out of this, again, it's a long and complicated process, was soon a form of politics divided by religious community, by sect, what we would now call sectarianism. So in 1841, the first episode of civil war between Druze and Maronites in Mount Lebanon took place, and this affected Mikha'il Mishaqa's family very directly. In Deir al-Qamar, where he had grown up, the family home was attacked and burnt. One of his brothers was killed, another one was wounded, and the rest of the family fled to him, to Mikha'il, in Damascus for protection. So this was very traumatic for him, but it was also something he had not foreseen, I think. He didn't see it coming. It was hard to deal with in terms of the worldview he had built up in the 1820s, when he thought he had the politics of the Shahabi Emirate and then even of the Egyptian regime sorted. He understood how to deal with these men of power of many different religions and to do deals among them, all, people of the elite, and patch up these kinds of differences. There are now other kinds of forces involved, which I think are less comprehensible to him, the forces of sectarianism and, in a sense, of populism. I mean, the idea of popular representation is also coming into politics, with people of less elite backgrounds taking on political roles. So I think in the wake of 1841, it comes to seem to Mikha'il that he has not understood so well the politics of his place and time. This new major crisis has come and affected his family and his world. He hasn't seen it coming. And I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that it's from this point onwards that he begins to look again for religious truth. Again, he doesn't say this explicitly anywhere. He doesn't trace his change in religious opinions to these events, but I don't think it's coincidental. So this is my interpretation, that in some ways it is again a response to instability and crisis that sets him looking for a different kind of path, because he's dissatisfied with this rationalistic explanation which claimed that religions are superstitious and irrelevant and that politics is understandable in terms of things like natural laws which can predict human behavior. So he begins to find religious truth then in the work published by the American and British Protestant missionaries. They're now well established here in Beirut, building up their printing press, a small community of Syrian Protestant converts, and the schools which would one day give rise to this institution, AUB. And in 1842 or 43, Mikha'il comes across a book that's been translated into Arabic by the Protestant missionaries in Malta. One of the translations was actually Faris al-Shujaa, among others. And this is called Evidence of Prophecy, or, the full title is up there, Evidence of the Truth of the Christian Religion Revealed in Prophecy. So this was actually, it's a very strange book, really, but it was at the time a bestseller in Protestant evangelical circles in English. And it was by this man, the Scottish Presbyterian minister, Alexander Keith. And he had basically sat down in his vicarage in Scotland with, on the one hand, the Bible, and on the other hand, the writings of travellers who had gone to the Holy Land, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon. And he went through and found the places where God had predicted, this city will be destroyed, made a prophecy, this will happen to this people and their city. And then he found a traveller who is describing the ruins of this city. And from this, he say, well, look, it's come true. The Bible is true. It's been proved empirically to be the case, because who could have known back then that this would come true, and yet it has. And he even cites the travel narrative of the deist, Volney, who was so influential for Mishaqa earlier in support of his claims. And he has engravings and later photographs to accompany the book. He actually meets Mikha'il Mishaqa rather later when he's on a trip to take photographs of the Holy Land. So, again, it's quite an odd book, but it was an example of a newly rationalistic style in Arabic writings around religion at the time. Because these Protestant missionaries, when they came into the Mediterranean, had encountered not only people that they described as believers, whether they're Muslims or Christians or Jews or Druze or any other religion, but also people that they described as infidels. That is, people who didn't really believe any of the religions on offer at all. People in Mikha'il Mishaqa's position. And this was because the missionaries were not so interested in the community belonging of these individuals, but in what they believed within. There's this Protestant emphasis on inner faith. And so they could see and describe people who they thought that their beliefs were rather different from those of the communities around them. And there are many others that they found throughout the Mediterranean, and then gradually in groups of young men who were dissatisfied with the various Christian churches of Syria through the 1840s. And in order to convince these people that Protestantism is true, they wrote, in addition to the books that they wrote attacking other religions, they wrote books which were supposed to be proving Christianity true from first principles and through rationalistic arguments. And Keith's is an example of this kind of writing. And at least that was how Mikha'il Mishaqa saw it when he came to read this book in 1842 or 43. He thought it was very different, as he says, to the way that the clerics of his own church, the doctors of my church, use in their writings. And again, he's judging it, so I won't read out the whole thing, so otherwise I'll take up too much time. But, he's judging it by the standard of reason. Aql, al-aqul as-salima, sound minds or reasons will reject this style of argument, but it may be acceptable to argue in the way that Keith, the Englishman, which is untrue, he's a Scot. So he, after some thought, some hesitation, he finds these arguments convincing. And over the next few years, between 1844 and 48, he draws closer to the American Protestant missionaries, partly through being involved with them in the story of a group of people who have converted from Greek Orthodox Christianity to Protestantism in Hasbaya, where he used to live. And he also builds up a close friendship with the leading American missionary here in Beirut, Eli Smith, and they write letters to each other through this period very frequently, which are one of the best sources for Mikha'il Mishaqa's ideas. And also he's embroiled in disputes within his own community, what he's still formally part of, the Greek Catholic Church of Damascus, which I won't go into in detail, but they're becoming quite bitter disputes. So, in 1848, in November, he takes finally an irrevocable step of announcing his belief, as he puts it, in the Christian faith according to the Holy Scriptures, by which he means Bible Christianity, Protestantism. And soon then gets into a very bitter controversy with this man, the head of the Greek Catholic Church, Maximus Mazloum, who is in Damascus at the time. And this led him quite rapidly into printing his own controversial ideas, his religious claims, defending Catholicism and defending Protestantism and attacking Catholicism, and which were printed here in Beirut by the American missionaries for him. So there's a kind of war of words going on between him and Mazloum, in which Mazloum has the power of the church and the Greek Catholic community, but Mishaqa has the printing press, which Mazloum doesn't have such direct access to. So it's interesting, again, this is another area that Mishaqa's story can lead us into. On the one hand, what does it mean to convert? On the other hand, what are the conditions of this kind of print culture at this time, at a point where there's print, but there's also other things? Thinking about the history of things like the Arab Nahda, it's interesting to put him into this context. I think this is the first time that the printing press has been used to respond in real time to a controversy of this kind. So this is printed as a serialized set of pamphlets because they want to strike while the iron is hot, while this is still a live issue in people's minds. And they print the first bit of the pamphlet while Mishaqa is still working on the second part. So he's denouncing in these writings the irrational superstitions, the priestly inventions of the Catholics, in very similar terms to those he had used of religion in general when he was a deist, before he became a Protestant. So this kind of, this idea of reason is still extremely important for him. It's the weapon that he's using against the Catholics. But on the other hand, he doesn't believe anymore in reason alone, in human reason unaided by anything from God or the divine. So he also writes another religious tract, which the missionaries print, but this isn't against the Catholics or against any other religion, but it's against the skeptics. It's against the people who share the kind of beliefs that he used to have. Because there were others in his youth, in Dumyat and also in Deir al-Amr, who had shared these beliefs and who were part of a circle who had also probably been influenced by the same writings of the Damietta translations, although we don't know as much about them as we do about Mikha'il. So this tract is called Al-Burhan ala Da'f al-Insan, the proof of the weakness of man, or humanity. And this means the weakness of human reason. And it originates actually as a letter to his own brother, who still holds these deist opinions from their youth. And now he's arguing that the rational man, al-aqil, should know, before anything else, his first duty, his weakness, the inadequacy of his knowledge. So he's using reason itself and a lot of rational and mathematical and scientific examples to show that rational judgments are changeable and uncertain. We believe one thing one day and then something else comes along and makes us change our minds and we believe another thing. All we can do is to understand things as they appear to us in that particular moment. And I think, again, we can see this perhaps as a response to the crisis of 1841 and more generally to the dramatic change in the politics of Syria over the 1830s and 40s. Mikha'il Mishaqa's earlier understanding, based on reason and reason alone in this Voltairean, Volneyan sense, had been shown to be weak. He hadn't seen these new changes coming. But his new belief, a rational Christianity, can in some way help to account for this. It can show where reason doesn't work as well, because then we can turn to revelation from God, which is a surer guide and can allow us to see more than we can see by reason alone. And it also, this belief in Protestantism gives him a kind of platform to attack Catholic beliefs, as I've been saying, publicly and in print. I mean, he couldn't do this as a deist. Now he can print that the Catholic beliefs are irrational and claim that in a public way. And he's also able to put these arguments to members of other religious communities. So the first people he distributes his first tract to in Damascus are actually the Muslim elite and the ulama, because they are very powerful and influential in his own business dealings as a doctor and as a merchant. But also, I think, because he's drawing to some extent on Muslim rationalist arguments, Ash'ari arguments, in putting forward these beliefs and trying to, in some ways, show that Protestantism is relatively close to Islam, or a reformist version of Islam. You say, well, we also reject images and superstitions and transubstantiation and saints and these things. So this is a true religious doctrine and also one that you should find respectable. So it's this rational Christianity, this belief in the Bible, but the Bible proved to be true by reason, which sustains Mikha'il Mishaqa for the rest of his life through another set of instabilities, upheavals. In 1860, as I mentioned, along with other Christians of the Christian quarter of Damascus, he's attacked by a Muslim crowd in a very bloody episode of sectarian violence. These are the ruins beginning to be reconstructed in the aftermath of this. He fled through his streets with his two young children. He was badly beaten in the head. He was very lucky to escape with his life, but was able then to re-establish himself in Damascus as a prosperous man of business. He was also vice consul for the United States of America, so in contact with, again, another set of foreign patrons. And he passed these positions on to his sons. He kept up a reputation for learning across a very broad range of subjects, mathematics, music, medicine, and he writes his memoirs, which I've quoted from. In 1873, this very shrewd and vivid account of the events around him and his own life. He dies in 1888 as a very well-known and I think in many ways quite a sort of respected figure in Damascus. So he left a load of writings across a very wide range of topics, and from one perspective you could see him as a pioneer of rationalism, of scientific thought. He was celebrated in these terms by later writers of the Arab Nahda like Jurji Zaidan. From another perspective though, he was very much a religious figure, you know, the Protestant polemicist. And his religious writings then entered into a different kind of canon of Muslim as well as Christian religious debate. So some of these PDFs that I found of his religious writings you will now find on Dawah websites on the internet for the propagation of Islam, because they're part of a canon of controversial writings which Muslim controversialists need to keep up with, apparently. So again, you know, one of the other themes I use Mikha'il Mishaqa as a way into in the book is to show that there is a kind of rational secularism that we associate with the Nahda, and on the other hand, a kind of religious revivalism which we might associate with the American Protestant missionaries, or with Catholic reformists, or indeed with the early Salafi reformists, the Muslim reformists of the time. But that these two tendencies, revivalism and, if you like, secularism, share something. They share an emphasis on reason, the need to defend one's beliefs rationally against a large number of other positions. So, again, just to reflect briefly on Mikha'il Mishaqa and his different conversions. As I've said, we can see each one of his changes of belief and opinion as a response to a new set of crises and instabilities, taqallubat, as he calls them. And he comes to very different conclusions at different points in his life. I mean, astrology, Enlightenment deism and science, and then biblical, literalist, evangelical Protestantism. But there is, I think, a common thread running through these, which is this attempt to explain the taqallubat al-dahr, the vicissitudes of fortune around him, through his reason, to come to some kind of rational explanation of these. And again, there may be something that we can take from this thinking and reflecting from where we are now. Although Mikha'il Mishaqa is a very privileged man, you know, a very wealthy, influential man for much of his life, he's also repeatedly affected by these catastrophes, these disasters. When he writes of the 1860 events, for instance, he uses the term musiba, a disaster, but also with these overtones of affliction by fate. And I think, you know, it is possible, you know, to look on the history of this part of the world, you know, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, perhaps particularly from the perspective of the present, as one musiba after another, one disaster stacking up on top of the next. But I think Mikha'il Mishaqa is interesting because of his particular response to this, which is to say, not that this is fate afflicting us, not simply, you know, that's how it is, but to try to come to some kind of rational explanation, work out why it is that these things are happening. He refused to see the catastrophes around him simply as dahr, but he went further, understand the taqallubat al-dahr, the instabilities of fate, through his reason, through this category of al-aql. Now, the actual explanations he came up with may seem very strange to us now, whether it's astrology or, you know, his particular form of Enlightenment deism or his particular Protestant beliefs. But there may be something that we can take perhaps from this repeated effort to rationally come to terms with events which are very shocking and very traumatic and which he was living through. So I think I'll leave it on that note and hand over now to VARAK for a further conversation. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, can everyone hear me well? Okay. First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Sonia, for organizing this. It's a pleasure, and thank you for Peter, for giving me the opportunity to be in conversation with you. First of all, I really would like to congratulate you for this magnificent work. It's written perfectly, brilliantly, and for those of you who have not read it yet, I strongly recommend that you buy the book and read it, because you're missing it out. So before we actually get into the juicy details of this book, I just wanted to make a few notes, and then as a conversation starter, a few questions, and I'm sure a lot of you have other questions, so we won't monopolize the conversation.
Definitely.
So you begin with this simple, but in many ways loaded question on page 5. What did people believe in the 19th century Middle East? So this is the question you open up the book with, but once we read the book, it's an account that goes much further than a discussion of religion, faith, and beliefs, and it ends up answering, among other questions and issues, the main question is, at least the way I read it, is how did wars, reforms, imperialism, and violence shape the boundaries between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in a society that was transforming at the time? I think you brilliantly document the changing patterns of communal belonging, sectarianism, revivalism, secularism, and the impact of scientific inquiry. And in many ways, Mishaqa's life is extraordinary, as you highlighted, and unusual because of his privileges and his connections, but in many other ways, he is the product of his times. He is the product of his social environment, and I think there's a brilliant synthesis of these two aspects in the book. One of the first questions as a historian that really interested me is, I see this book as part of a recent trend of intellectual and social biographies that Sonia has recently contributed to, among other scholars like Marilyn Booth in her biography of Zainab Fawaz, Shukran Olu of his biography of Mustafa Kemal. So this is more than a history of a regular Christian figure who is influenced by Western ideas and missionaries, you know, the conventional Nahda story that we are used to. So you very clearly shed light on the making of Mikha'il Mishaqa in his environment, and how he was an influential, wealthy person, a moneylender, a merchant, but at the same time an intellectual who was really reflecting on these questions. So one of the first questions I had is, what are some of the challenges of writing such a biography of a pretty eccentric figure who in many ways defies the categories that we use to understand the Nahda or the 19th century? What are some of the methodological challenges? What are some of the personal challenges you had as you went through the archives, which I will talk about in a few minutes?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for your kind words about the book. But yeah, I mean, this question certainly of approaching history through biography or microhistory is one that I've just been discussing with Sonia and, as you mentioned, Marilyn Booth in Oxford. So I won't sort of just repeat what we were saying, but I think that there is a certain turn towards doing this. It's interesting. Exactly where it's come from is a sort of open question, which I hope we can, continue to discuss. But I think it does give certain kinds of insights that one doesn't get from a more conventional historical account, partly because by following an individual like this, you have to go where he goes. He leads you to places which you didn't expect to find, whether they're actual communities that he lived in or places that he lived in, like Hasbaya. Who's written the history of Hasbaya? But I had to, you know. I mean, there are a few, local histories. I'm not saying that I'm the first, but, or Dumyat, again, the Syrian Christian community of Damietta. But also into intellectual traditions that he's learning from or contributing to. I didn't expect to find myself reading about Greek Orthodox Christian theology very much when I set out on this project, but nonetheless I had to read my way into it a certain amount because these are one of the things that are relevant for him. So this is, as you say, a challenge. It leads you into a lot of different archives and a lot of different kinds of intellectual traditions. So there's a challenge of bringing together things that may be in different languages and in very widely scattered places. Rather than a more conventional study which will be based on this archive, working on a particular set of documents and the perspective from that one. One's a little bit like a magpie, sort of picking from different things. But I think it is illuminating, because you can say, well, all of these rather unexpected things are tied together, at least by this man's story, and that can lead you to see facets of this society which you wouldn't otherwise have put together. And the plurality of different kinds of intellectual tradition or community or experience, and how these are in some ways united by, as you say, an unusual figure. And there's also the question of the norm. The great question of sort of microhistory is, are these just sort of strange eccentrics and they don't matter because they're very atypical and abnormal? But I think there was an answer given to this by Giovanni Levi, one of the original sort of Italian microhistorians back in the 70s, was that these eccentric figures can give you not the norm, but the degree of variation from the norm, the limits of what's possible in this society. And that's also important to know. We don't just want to know about what's typical and what most people do. We want to know how possible it is to go away from that. So if we're thinking of Mikha'il Mishaqa, how possible is it to lose one's faith and diverge completely from religious belief? Okay, he's extreme. Not very many people went to where he did and adopted this kind of deist position. But nonetheless, you can use him as a way into this question of what are the different steps, what are the different gradations between that and what we might think of as simply orthodox faith. Yeah. So I don't know if that really answered what you
Actually, this in many ways anticipated my second question, is because we're discussing his conversion or his transformation in a period where the Ottoman reforms are taking place. This is at the beginning of the Tanzimat reforms in the 1840s. And as you clearly say and show in the book, this is really the unmaking of religious heterodoxies and what we can call the demarcation of religious boundaries among different communities that in many ways helped the centralization of the Ottoman state. And again, you make the point and the compelling argument that religious identities gain a higher political valence as European powers became more entangled in the Ottoman domestic affairs. So, although you answered this question briefly in the presentation, I want you to basically unpack what conversion means in this period, whether it's an act of descent, it's a recalibration of faith, something else, it's an adaptation to changing political, economic circumstances, which you highlighted.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it can be all of these things, and that's in a sense the challenge. Mikha'il Mishaqa writes his own very self-interested versions of why he's converted. He simply says, I found this book and its arguments were convincing. And to some extent, because I was telling his story, that's the version that I've given you here. But there are all of these other things going on behind this. There's a deep dispute within the Greek Catholic community, the Rum Catholic community of Damascus, which pits Mikha'il Mishaqa and his allies, who are the lay, non-clerical notables, the elite wealthy families of the community, against Maximus Mazlum, who's the head of this reformist project, and has also risen from quite humble origins to become patriarch of the sect, and then wants to control and demarcate this religious community in a way that people of Mikha'il Mishaqa's generation and standing are not used to. They're not used to having their marriages and divorces not granted and interfered with by the clerics, or being told what they should believe and exactly how they should behave religiously. They'd been used to a certain degree of ambiguity, but also of toleration because they were wealthy and well connected. So there is certainly this social background to it as well. And it's also quite striking that, I think Mikha'il Mishaqa wants to bring a number of these other people over to Protestantism with him. He's still operating within the Greek Catholic community when he announces his belief in Christianity according to the Holy Scriptures, or the phrase that he uses. And this fails. The others remain Greek Catholics and don't go with him. He's left on his own. So the question of whether one can convert as an individual successfully is also an interesting one.
I mean, even he himself is reluctant to publicly accept his conversion.
Yeah, it takes him several years. I mean, I think he reads this book by Alexander Keith probably in 1842 or 43. He then meets and starts becoming, a close friend of Eli Smith in 1844, and also helping the Hasbaya Protestants who the missionaries are then in contact with. But it takes him until 1848 to actually make this public step himself. And that's partly because the conversion that you can experience inwardly, what, as he puts it once in his memoirs, people keep in their hearts, is different to one's public standing, potentially at least. You know, there can be a difference. But it's also, I think, because this is a process. He's still, you know, testing things out, deciding what the correct stance to take is. Does he really have to go this far? What does he really believe? Mm-hmm. And does he actually finally come to a decision until he's taken a step which is irrevocable? One doesn't know, because his own accounts are written after this as a kind of rationalization of how he got to that point. And I think often, the actual process can be rather messier and more ambiguous than these, ex post facto accounts that people come up with. Which is a challenge of working with other people's autobiographies as well, their own memoirs.
One of the fascinating questions is, or one of the fascinating sources that you use in this biography is his memoirs, which were written in 1873. So I'm really curious why he decided to write a memoir. As someone who's also interested in the politics of memoirs and memoirs writing, he's writing his memoirs pretty much at the end of his life, after all these disasters and catastrophes that he has survived and experienced. And what is really, or who's the audience of the memoir? Because in his earlier tracts, there is a clear audience, there is a clear target, let's say, whether it's Muslim or anyone else. So I was just curious what the politics of his memoirs writing were.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, the first memoir he writes is one of the tracts.
Yes.
His first religious tract is an account of how he came to lose his religious faith and then to find it again as a Protestant. And he narrates this in the first person as he tells it in autobiographical terms. And I think that comes from a particular Protestant tradition of, the conversion narrative and the sort of individual journey of faith. So to some extent, it's building on models that are coming from the American missionaries, and that sort of idea of an individual being at the center of a religious story. But it's many years later, as you say, towards the end of his life, when he writes his other memoir, the more famous one in many ways, Al-Jawab ala Iqtirah al-Ahbab. And as the title suggests, it's the answer to the request of his friends. He is at least claiming that it was friends who came to him and said, you should write down, you have lived such a, interesting and exciting life, and, you should write this down in a memoir to tell us about both the history of your family and of your times, but also your own story at the center of this. But it may well be that because he had this experience of writing an earlier, more religiously oriented memoir, that also played a role in why he put himself so centrally into that story. Because that's quite unusual at this point. It's not uncommon for people of his kind of background and generation to write a chronicle of the history of what they're living through. But to have so much that's about them themselves is rather unusual, I think. And he's been picked out by people like Thomas Phillip as a sort of pioneer of autobiographical writing in Arabic at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's really for an audience of, I think, friends and acquaintances. It remains in manuscript. There are many manuscript copies made within his lifetime, because he lives on for a good sort of 15 years after this. But I think it's also not perhaps a coincidence that in the same year that he writes his memoir, he writes his will. And passes over many of his responsibilities to his sons. And, he's still suffering the effects of a nervous disease he'd had from earlier and from being beaten in 1860. And he lives the rest of his life really in retirement in his house in Damascus. So I think in some ways it's a gesture of passing, withdrawing and passing this on to other people, perhaps. There's maybe not the political answer, but
yeah. I mean, when I was reading the book, it really struck me that this is a man in many ways full of paradoxes that I couldn't really make sense of. He may be seen as someone who is very politically shrewd and knows how to basically maneuver and navigate his way through these different disasters and events, but at the same time, he is making a commitment, or is committing to a religious community that was in many ways the most vulnerable at the time. As we are talking about these processes where the Protestants are becoming much more visible, the Catholics are becoming much more religiously or communally consolidated, he's committing to the Protestants who were persecuted by the Ottoman authorities, as well as by the other Christian sects and communities. So that was really something that I didn't really understand, or maybe it made sense to him. But
I don't claim to understand it either. No, I think it is a contradiction. I think he is a man full of paradoxes.
I think one of the other paradoxes that I noticed is he is a resourceful man. He knows how to make use of the printing press, the text farming, the silk trade, money lending. So he's a very resourceful man, but he uses his resourcefulness in a time where the old order is dying, but he still latches on to the old order, kind of this nostalgic vision that in many ways the old order was better than the sectarian and the confessional landscape that we see from the 1840s onwards. And I think when we were having the conversation yesterday, you pretty much explained why he resisted going to Beirut when Beirut was becoming the place to be at the time. He stayed in Damascus despite the many calls of his friends and family.
Yes, I mean, particularly after 1860, lots of Christians, in particular from Damascus, moved to Beirut or to other they go abroad and so on. And certainly some members of his family and friends are saying, no, come to Beirut, it's the obvious place for you to be. But he stays in Damascus. And it's interesting, one of the things I talk about at the very end of the book is when Jurji Zeydan, from a younger generation of, Beirut-educated Nakhba scholars, goes to visit him in Damascus, and how he sees him as, in many ways, somebody he respects. He writes about him in his book, Mikha'il Mishaqa, how he loves the fact that Mikha'il Mishaqa thinks he can use his reason to think his way to the end of any problem. He has this wonderful sort of self-reliance that he can figure it out in the end. I think Zeydan really respects this as somebody who is greatly enamored of science and technology and progress and so on. But on the other hand, Mikha'il Mishaqa is this rather old-fashioned figure. He's there sitting in his, robes and his turban, whereas, Zeydan is probably wearing a suit and a tarbouch, at least when he's, in Beirut. He has this sort of, Zeydan describes his kind of old-fashioned Damascene courtesy in welcoming him to his house, which is obviously very nice, but it also perhaps puts him in this older generation and this slightly, old-fashioned sort of social status. So, yeah, I think that he does remain somebody who, unlike Zeydan, he never sort of tries to write the history of his life and times or of his world as one of progress, of, stages of progress that move necessarily on to another and a better world. I don't think he sees it like that. I think he is still harking back to the Shahabi Emirate and using that as his standard by which to judge the new politics that he's encountering.
Which at the time politics were not confessional, or the confessionalization of politics wasn't as visible as it became.
It was something which, I guess, as he might have seen it, it was a situation in which men of power and influence of many different religious communities could get together and figure things out among themselves and do a deal, rather than these more unruly energies of sectarianism, but also of representation and of, politics of the lower classes, rather than those interrupting that kind of political world. And it's quite striking, he adopts from Volney, the French philosophe, all of these ideas critical of religion. Volney is also very critical of monarchy and aristocracy. I mean, he's really a man of the French Revolution. Mishaqa doesn't go there at all. He doesn't adopt any of those because I think he is very much, in his whole social background, tied to an elite mode of politics, but a multi-confessional one, as you say.
Which I think brings me to my other question about his overall explanation, because you say reason for him alone was weak, and therefore faith or revelation was needed to understand the world for salvation or for salvation. So how is this understanding that he comes to is reflected in his own explanation of the causes of the 1860 massacres and the violence?
Of 1860? Yeah, yes. Well, again, I mean, I think in some ways he has two different moments when he responds to 1860. One is in the moment itself, And I mean, Eugene Rogan has written about this more than I have. You know, he writes a number of reports as the US vice consul, which are really calling on European powers to intervene and save the Christians. He's identifying clearly as a Christian. And he's been put in this position. You know, I mean, one can see why this was, but that's the nature of his response. And his response is, if you like, a sectarian one. You know, he's saying Christian powers should intervene to save Christians. This is the only way it could work. And, you know, later on, he changes his position and he begins to say, well, actually, it's, you know, partly that the Christians were to blame. They'd got above themselves. They'd started trying to show off around, you know, Damascus and display their new wealth and status, and to look as if they were competing with the Muslim elite. I mean, he will also blame the rabble, the lower classes of the, you know, for of the Muslim community for being the ones who actually carry out the violence. But I think there is this element of trying to sort of see different kinds of responsibility. That in some ways it's people have got how to relate to each other politically wrong, rather than simply it is this community versus this other community. And again, I think he's already, because 1860, he doesn't change his beliefs after that. You know, this is a crisis he lives through, and he remains a Protestant and a rational Christian, if you like. But the one that I think did set him on that path was 1841, which is similar in some ways. You can find him writing in the moment, you know, very soon after the attack on Deir el-Qamar, which destroyed his family's house and killed his brother. He's writing really, you know, in quite a Christian vein against the Druze, that this is, you know, he's identifying as a Christian and talking about the battles of the Christians versus the Druze, like a lot of other, you know, Christian writers of the time. When he writes about that later on, or when he sort of reflects on these events in, you know, his religious writings, I think he doesn't have this view. He's more, as I've said, kind of harking back to the old order of the Shahabi Emirate, which could deal with these divisions and differences, rather than seeing the communities as opposed to each other necessarily. So,
which I think inevitably brings us to the question or the discussion about his differences with those of Butros al-Bustani. How Butros al-Bustani deals with the whole aftermath of the 1860 massacres, his whole understanding of what we nowadays would call Syrian patriotism or Ottoman patriotism, as opposed to what Mishaqa suggests as a solution to this problem, going back to the old traditional order where gentlemen and the ayans would come together and discuss politics rather than the
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that Mishaqa identifies with the new Ottoman state, it's to the extent that replicates that old order. You know, it's because it has also become a world in which, you know, there is what historians have referred to as the long peace in Mount Lebanon, for instance, where there are no longer, after 1860, for a long time, you know, very kind of violent and overt episodes of sectarian conflict, and where there are people one can go and talk to and do deals with, and, you know, there is that kind of ability for elites to, you know, talk to each other, even if it's within a situation in which the political salience of confessional identities is greater than it had been before. I think that's also true. So I think, I think in many ways that does remain his model, although it's difficult to tell, you know, because he doesn't really write very much after his memoir. So, you know, he lives for quite a long time after that, and we don't know exactly what he's thinking politically or in other ways at that time. But, yeah, I mean, Butros al-Bustani is somebody he knows. You know, he will be writing to Eli Smith, and you can find bits in his letters sort of saying, you know, send my greetings to Butros al-Bustani and to Nassif al-Yazaji, and he's very much part of this community around the American missionaries and the American mission press. Bustani has also spent time in Hasbaya as a preacher for the missionaries, so he's experienced that episode where the Protestants in Hasbaya are being attacked very violently by the Greek Orthodox Christians there as one of sectarian violence of that kind, which I don't think has particularly been usually mentioned in accounts of where Bustani's ideas about this are coming from. But yeah, I don't think that he has quite the same kind of formation. I mean, Bustani is somebody who starts out to train in a Maronite college, potentially as a Maronite cleric, and then becomes a Protestant and is attached to the missionaries as an employee, and then later distances himself somewhat from the missionaries and takes on a rather more independent role in a kind of new role as a sort of cultural and intellectual entrepreneur, and the founder of a school and a press, and a sort of mini business empire in the sort of cultural field here in Beirut. Mikha'il Mishaqa has this rather more old-fashioned, career as a Syriathe and a banker and advisor to rulers, as well as taking on these sort of new patronage links to the Egyptians or to the Europeans. And his relationship to the missionaries is always a bit more arm's length. He's not ever paid by them or employed by them. And there are some American missionaries in Damascus who he's not very friendly with. He prefers the ones in Beirut, perhaps partly because they're not in Damascus, and they're, So he sort of maintains his own independence in his own right. And also, he's not formally educated. He's very sort of privileged and becomes extremely, extremely well educated, but largely through informal education or self-education. So I think he's a bit more of a sort of autodidactic character, finding his own way through, perhaps, as you say, to a rather more eccentric view of things. Whereas I think Bastani he can be seen, more clearly as somebody who's identified with early on a sort of, Maronite clerical tradition, and then a Protestant one, and very closely tied to the Protestants, and then with this sort of emerging project of the Nahda in its Beirut form, with its links to the Tanzimat project of the Ottoman state. Whereas I think Mikha'il Mishaqa is somewhat at arm's length from all of these things. Yeah. He has his And this is interesting as well, it gives you a slightly sideways, oblique view on these historical phenomena that we think we know all about. It's like, okay, well, no, don't look at it centrally, but look at it from over here, where this strange character is, and maybe it appears in a different light.
Which he is in many ways. He is this eccentric, strange, non-conventional Nahda character. Okay, we can continue this conversation.